Well, good afternoon. We are on day 2 of Nehemiah and the law of navigation. So we're delighted that you can join us today here in the chapel and on Zoom as well, and perhaps those of you who might be viewing this after the fact. Welcome to all of you. We got a lot of stuff to go over and just 21 minutes to go over it, so we're going to jump right in. So with that, you all are familiar now with the law of navigation, which says anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. Very big difference, of course, between those two things. What we want to focus on today, as far as our thought for the day, is that leaders find purpose in the needs around them. So basically, it's not about themselves, but about the needs that they uncover that are all around them. And so today we're going to be talking about the subject of burdens. Burdens. By way of introduction, we want you to see that it's a burden that ultimately leads to a vision, which ultimately then leads to taking action to address the burden. But it starts with the burden. Really, it even starts at the need, which creates the burden, which then leads to a vision, which then leads to action. So those 4 steps kind of comprise this whole system, and we see this very poignantly, and we'll get into this when we go back into Nehemiah. So with that, we'll start with a question. Have you ever thought about what prompts a leader to step forward and champion a cause? What starts that process? What brings the vision to life in the leader so that he or she can bring the people to life to fulfill it? The answer is found in the life of Nehemiah. It started with a report from his brother. When Nehemiah got that report from his brother and the others who came to visit him, that report stirred something deeply inside of him. When he heard that the walls of Jerusalem were in ruins, that the people were completely demoralized, and of course surmised, in addition to that, that God's reputation thus was tarnished, Nehemiah had to do something about it. And so we discover in the scripture that he immediately went to weeping and fasting and praying for several days. No one had to tell him to do this. No one ordered him to do this. It was just something that welled up deep within him. And so with that in mind, listen to the words of Nehemiah's prayer. We'll actually share not all of the prayer in chapter 1, but 4 verses kind of in 2 different segments. In verses 5 and 6, Nehemiah says, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. He actually goes on to confess his own personal sins and that of his family as well. Then moving on to verses 10 and 11. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power. You notice all these references to you and your, and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. And we shared last time, I believe, that was a very important job because the cupbearer was the a person who had to drink the wine if it was poisoned and find out that instead of the king. But other than that, it was kind of a cush job. So we see by this report, and especially by Nehemiah's reaction to it, he didn't just say, "Oh boy, that's bad news. Oh, I wish things could be better." No, he had a very different response. And from the needs that were shared, a burden just began to flow within him, and it welled deeply and moved him, so that he had to do something about it. And so Nehemiah took a huge risk simply by displaying sadness before the king. Because in that time, Nehemiah being, not a native of Persia, but a captive, he wasn't allowed to just show up around the king with a sad face on it, a sad disposition. That was actually, in those days, a capital offense. Think about capital offenses. Have a sour look on your face. Well, and in his time, that's probably what would happen. And so the king notices by his countenance. In fact, I like the words here that the king says, "It can be nothing but sadness of heart." Isn't it funny how our hearts, what's in our heart is often reflected both in the words we say and even the expression of in our face. You kind of tell what's deep down inside of a person. And so the king referred to that as sadness of heart, of course, regarding Jerusalem. So why did he do it? Why did he take that kind of a risk, literally risking his life just to appear that way before the king? Well, it was because the report from his brother produced such a significant burden within Nehemiah that it forced him to take action. It was a situation that once he discovered the facts about Jerusalem and its people, he could not live with that reality. And so that required that he do something about it. So think about that, a reality that you cannot accept, that you cannot live with. That was the case with Nehemiah. So that was Nehemiah's burden. We want to take some time and talk about the power, the impact of a burden. What does that do in the heart of a leader? Nehemiah discovered his purpose as the result of a problem. We don't really know anything about Nehemiah other than the fact that he was a cupbearer before this. When this happens, it is a life-changing moment. And his life would never, ever be the same. This encounter right here in Nehemiah chapter 1 defined the rest of his life. That's pretty powerful. He was never the same again. So he discovered his purpose as a result of a problem. I wonder how many people fit that description. They really discover their purpose in the context of a problem. You see, godly leaders don't need to look for something to capture their heart. It comes looking for them. It comes calling for them as they seize the opportunities when they arise. Someone once said that you must seize the opportunity of a lifetime within the lifetime of the opportunity. And how true that is, that these windows can open and shut rather quickly. And so the application of that then is that we be ready. We have to be prepared before the opportunity comes, because that might just be, and in this case, it absolutely was, Nehemiah's opportunity of a lifetime. So, as I said, the calling comes to them. They don't have to go looking for it as they seize the opportunities when they arise. So the burden precedes and provides impetus for the leader's vision. A lot of people want the vision without the burden, but it's actually the burden that creates the vision. So consider the positive effects when a leader experiences a burden and then receives a vision to deal with it. So 3 things that we'll discuss. First, a burden purifies motives. Secondly, a burden cultivates persistence. And then finally, a burden cements conviction. So let's talk about these 3 things for just a few minutes. A burden purifies motives. Motives are so important. Sometimes 2 different actions can look the same externally, but what provides the impetus for those actions, in other words, the motive, means everything, certainly to God. And so a burden can purify motives. You see, a burden arises typically when others are in need. And you want to take action to address that need and bless others, or as I like to say, add value to them. So it starts with needs of other people. It doesn't start inside the leader. So this represents the essence then of what? Service. And you look at service and self-seeking, and you see that really they are mutually exclusive. They don't coexist together. That's why you hear so often the term servant leadership these days, because it is designed to combat the idea that the leader is the one who kind of sits back and does nothing and just orders everybody around and takes all the credit and the glory. No, the leader is a servant who sees and responds to needs and lifts up and encourages others and adds value to them. So Nehemiah, think about this. Nehemiah, even though he had the issue with, the cupbearer having to take the wine first, of course, obviously up until that point, he didn't have any poison wine, or else he wouldn't have still been in the job. So, up until that time, his job might have been described as kind of cush. I mean, he had direct access to the king. He could have just simply ignored the problem. Like I said, he could have just told his brother and the others that came, well, that's too bad. I feel bad for him. Maybe I'll send him an email, something like that, and or a card of condolence. He could have ignored the problem. I mean, look at it this way. For the past over 100 years, close to 120 years, everybody else had ignored the problem. Why not Nehemiah? He could have simply ignored it and remained in the position that he was in at the time, hoping that someone else would do it. Don't we live in a world like that so often? We say, well, just let someone else do it. Moses tried that on God. Oh, God, send somebody else. Didn't work. God said, no, Moses, you're the man. So instead of Nehemiah simply ignoring the problem, he chose instead to leave the comfort of the palace and undergo what certainly in that time was a very arduous trip back to the land of Israel, where all kinds of danger, from weather, from natural things to enemies, were in place there. A very arduous trip to a ruined city and a discouraged people. And that takes a lot of fortitude to even have the wherewithal to do that, but also requires a significant sacrifice. So a burden also cultivates persistence. Leaders face many different kinds of challenges, both from circumstances and especially, I think, from people. Sometimes it may be easier to throw in the towel before the mission is accomplished. A burden will help sustain the leader's motivation to keep going. Consider the many challenges Nehemiah faced and how he persisted to the end. There's a note there in chapter 4, and I've taken notice of this through the years. In chapter 4 there in Nehemiah, it says that the work had gotten to the halfway point. And isn't it interesting? It was only when the work got to the halfway point when the leaders who were, let's say, foremen in today's language, they noticed that there was a whole lot of rubble still left. The halfway point, I think, can often be the hardest time in a task like this, because you've already exerted a lot of effort. There's been a lot of work done. There's been a lot of effort, blood, sweat, tears, so to speak, invested. but there's still so much more to go. Think of that football team who starts on their 10-yard line and they run 7, 8, 9 plays, but they're still only on the 50-yard line. So yes, they've made progress, but they've exerted a lot of effort to get to where they are. But yet there's still that next 50 yards halfway down the field. So it's that halfway point that often becomes a real struggle. But that's why the burden can keep going, can keep the leader going, can keep the people going, knowing that we just keep pressing in and it will get done. So let's talk about conviction. Leaders are often bombarded with many needs. Part of the challenge is that we might want to respond to them all, but we can't respond to them all. And sometimes it can be a challenge to figure out which ones to respond to. When a leader experiences a significant burden, though, regarding a particular need, that burden will help issue a clarion call to help the leader know, yep, this is the one. Not that I may address or that it might be a good idea to address, but the one I must address, regardless of the risk involved. Again, consider Nehemiah. More than once, he put his life on the line to see the wall around Jerusalem rebuilt. Remember, Nehemiah had never been to Jerusalem. He was a captive all his life. Had always been in Persia. How easy it would be to think, why do I, as some might say today, not my circus, not my monkey. Instead, Jerusalem was his heart was there. His God was there. His people was there. That's why he had to respond. So there's a couple of things that I want to share, a couple of questions really about 8. And we'll just run through them real quickly. These questions are designed to help you recognize whether this issue, let's say you got several different needs and then you're confronted with them and you're saying, well, how do I know that one of these, or maybe 2 or whatever, but how do I distinguish amongst them so that I know this is the burden that I have to work on? So I'll just throw these questions out and you can ponder them. Number 1, does a person or project constantly come to your mind as a concern? Sometimes you'll get something, it'll hit you, you say, oh boy, that's too bad. But honestly, you kind of let it go and you don't give it much of a second thought. But there are other times when you hear something and you just can't, you're just always thinking about it, right? No matter what you happen to be doing, your mind kind of goes back to that situation. Secondly, do you seem unable to escape the needs of this concern? Third, are you constantly trying to challenge others to be concerned for this project? So something that burdens you, you just find yourself talking to other people about it. It really is true. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, no matter what it is. And so when your heart is burdened, you're going to be looking for other people to share that with. Fourth, do you migrate to books or sermons or articles or people that focus on the concern? Do you see how this can naturally, it gets a hold of your attention, and so you just kind of camp there. Get resources, get people, talk about it, think about it, pray about it, just exactly what Nehemiah did. Do you repeatedly give time and resources to meet this particular need? Does your concern move you to the point of tears? Is there emotion there? Do you have gifts and abilities to meet the needs associated with this concern? And then finally, does your concern increase or decrease with time? So it brings us to our conclusion. If you look at the scriptures, I believe that you can see that Nehemiah would have answered yes to the first 7 questions. Those are yes and no questions. And he would have said increase to the last one. Clearly, the task of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls stirred his heart, and acting on that burden revealed the purpose of his life. And so that brings us to our question for today and our time to conclude. What need around you stirs your heart? What a good question to end on. What's stirring your heart? What need that you are aware of, or that you become aware of, stirs your heart? With that, we again want to remind you that I won't be here live, but tomorrow's lesson has been pre-recorded and it will be available at 3:30 tomorrow. I will look forward, of course, to seeing you all on Thursday, but you will see me tomorrow, even though I won't see you, but that's okay. God bless you all. We look forward to seeing you again Thursday. Thank you.